Let's get joined up. Today's show is brought to you by Audible, and right now you can get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/joinedup. There's over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle or MP3 player. So thanks for tuning in to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, a regular show about all things writing, including interviews with authors, screenwriters and key figures from the publishing industry. Plus loads of hints, tips and inspiration for all creatives. You can follow us on Twitter at JU Podcast, leave a quick iTunes review or just tell a friend. Hello and welcome to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, where a little procrastination can go a long way. I'm Wayne Kelly and it's episode 149 with debut novelist Clare Beams, talking about her book The Illness Lesson, her research process, how she learned a craft with short stories and how writing is all about taking risks. It's a great chat and I know you'll enjoy it. Before we get to that, my usual 2-minute catch-up stroke whinge about my writing or lack thereof. I mentioned in the most recent intro that I'd had an offer from another author to read the early chapters of my novel Safe Hands, which I pretty much lost all faith in some time ago. Don't get me wrong, I think the premise is sound, and I'd even go so far to say that some of my best writing appears in a few passages of the book, and I'm really proud of those. However, this most recent feedback chimes with a lot of the other misgivings expressed by agents and publishers so far, but it was expressed even more clearly and more articulately by upcoming guest Erica Waller, who very kindly offered to read it for me, so I appreciate that. It seems that a lot of readers, particularly female readers, have a real problem connecting with my protagonist, which, is a bit of a problem. He's a chauvinistic, selfish, sexist criminal who sleeps with a barmaid within the first couple of chapters, despite the fact that we've just learned he's got a terminally ill wife at home. And this was, of course, entirely deliberate on my part, the idea being that he's a deeply flawed human being, he's a terrible husband and father, and that over the course of the book he will, he'll atone for all that stuff and he'll learn some very difficult lessons. However, I've been consistently told I should soften his character and present more redeeming qualities early on, if I want to have any hope of A, getting published, or B, actually enticing readers to stick with the story past the first couple of chapters. It could be a structural issue, or it could just be that I don't have the skill necessary to pull it off, but it's kind of a moot point because it's time to accept that my protagonist and the male-dominated world that I've created for this particular story is perhaps a bit dated, and it's unlikely to find a wide audience in the current market, especially given that it's estimated that about 70% of fiction readers are women. So I could try to reshape this character that I've been writing on and off for about 5 years and deal with all the knock-on effects that will have for the rest of the book, effectively rewrite the whole thing. Or I could quietly put it back in the metaphorical drawer, clear the decks and start something entirely fresh. Or the middle ground option, I suppose, is to return to an old messy draft of the novel that I wrote before Safe Hands. That's in a totally different genre and it's got a much softer, more empathetic protagonist, but it was completed about 8 years ago and I suspect it's in a very, very bad way. I'll be honest, at the moment, I really don't think I can face totally rewriting Safe Hands, only to discover it might still not be a good fit for publishers. I'm in a bit of a quandary. My instinct says the best course of action is to firstly try to read that messy first draft from start to finish, see how it feels, assess if it's got any merit at all, even if it's just a premise, maybe I'll start again, and then make my decision whether to edit and rewrite that or just start something new. I don't know. Anyway, any and all suggestions are welcome, so please do get in touch with your thoughts and advice because I'd really appreciate it. And you can do that by tweeting me at JU Podcast, emailing wayne@waynekellywrites.com, or dropping me a line on the FB page. Also, don't forget to join the email mailing list at joinedupwriting.co.uk. It's totally free, and you get a couple of downloadable goodies when you sign up as well, and you'll also be the first to find out about upcoming shows and events. Right, whinge over, let's get to today's interview, a chat with Clare Beams. So Clare's new novel, The Illness Lesson, originally published in February of 2020 by Doubleday, was named a New York Times Editor's Choice, a Best Book of 2020 by Esquire and Bustle, and a Best Book of February by Time, O Magazine and Entertainment Weekly. Before that, her short story collection, We Show What We Have Learned, was published by Lookout Books and won the Bard Fiction Prize. She also has taught creative writing at Carnegie Mellon University and St Vincent College. The Illness Lesson is out right now everywhere you can find good books. Enjoy the chat, and I'll pop back at the end to wrap things up. Joined up writing. Hi Clare, thanks so much for coming on Joined Up Writing, really appreciate it. So why don't you start off just by giving us a sense of whereabouts in the world you're speaking to us from, and tell us how things are going.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me, first of all. So I am speaking to you today from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I live with my family, and it's been a strange year or so. I think like everyone, it's really sort of coming home just how long we've been doing this, you know. I think, this novel first came out in mid-February of 2020. And so, like my little sort of Facebook memories and everything have been of the book launch. And it just looks like I'm looking at a different world. It was
totally.
A room full of
You're
people
actually with real people. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It was just, and I mean, we shouldn't really have been doing that in mid-February, but we didn't know.
No. I was the same. I was doing, I actually went to LA in February. Which seems weird now to think that, because it was only a few weeks later that we were all locked down and told not to go anywhere and do anything. I know, but it's like, as you say, it's been a really, really strange old year. Yeah.
Right. But yeah, so things are basically fine. I have a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old, and they have been sort of in and out of school with remote learning and then in-person learning, and they are in a stretch of in-person learning now, which is always better
for everybody, for them and you.
Yes, exactly.
So you've actually got some more time. Okay, well, you kind of mentioned, as you say, your book originally came out last year, but why don't you tell us about that book, The Illness Lesson?
Sure. So The Illness Lesson is set in 1871 Massachusetts, where an aging transcendentalist philosopher has decided that he's going to sort of try one more time for fame and greatness to kind of reclaim what he had, by starting a school for girls that will sort of show the world this sort of radical idea that he has that girls can do all the same things that boys can do. So it's this sort of beautiful scheme. Our main character is his 29-year-old daughter, Caroline, who has been educated by him in much the way that he sort of envisions educating these girls. And so she has this sort of wonderful kind of classical education, but her life really has been tending her father's life rather than kind of living her own. They live in the middle of nowhere on this farm. Where she kind of is his caretaker mostly. And so he kind of co-opts her into teaching in this school, which, on the one hand, she is very excited about, and on the other hand, she has sort of seen for herself the ways in which he kind of opened a door and then didn't actually show her how to walk through that door in any kind of meaningful way. So the students arrive, these girls who they will be educating, and everything is sort of going well for a time. And then the students begin to have these very strange physical symptoms. They get rashes, they have twitches, they have fainting fits. And so the teachers have to decide what to do with this episode of sort of what they would have considered mass hysteria. Mm-hmm. And so what I've always sort of said about the book is that it's a book really about women's bodies and women's minds and the very long-standing tradition of doubting both.
Absolutely. So it's a great premise with some powerful themes, as you say. So can you remember what initially kind of sparked the idea and where it came from?
So when I started writing the book, we were living in Massachusetts. I taught high school English in Massachusetts for 6 years. And growing up as a kid, I had loved Little Women. I grew up in New England as well. And I must have read that book, 15, 20 times as a child. And so I went, I took myself on a little trip to a museum called Fruitlands in Massachusetts, which is the site of a kind of failed commune that Bronson Alcott, who was the father of Louisa May Alcott, attempted to start when Louisa May and her sisters were small. And it was meant to be this kind of experiment in communal living, where everyone would be equal, and they were gonna sort of be at one with nature and with the earth and with each other. And it was sort of this noble idea that really wasn't backed up by a lot of practical understanding of how to live in the middle of nowhere on a farm.
Yeah.
And so, they were trying to be fruitarians, but they didn't know how to do that, and because they didn't want to take anything sort of too forcefully from the earth. But they basically, like, they all almost starved because really no one knew how to farm or feed themselves really very well. So I kind of, and the museum is amazing. You can see the original kind of farmhouse, and it's this very kind of classical New England landscape. So I was, sort of wandering around there and looking at all of this land. And I just had this sort of mental image of I failed to mention this when I talked about the novel, but there's also a species of bird that I have invented in the book, which is this sort of very strange bright red bird that arrives just as the school is sort of beginning, and that ends up kind of having all kinds of thematic connections to the girls' bodies in lots of ways. But so the novel actually began, the seed of the novel was the image of those birds. So the idea of something like just a little too kind of bright to be in this New England landscape, and what kind of visual effect that would have. And I often begin that way as a writer. I'm often beginning with sort of just this image that is interesting and strange to me, and I don't usually quite know why. And then sort of as I kind of attempt to put that image down on the page, I often kind of discover the seeds of a story. And I had sort of suspected that I might want to write about teaching and sort of in a school and see if that could be a novel. And kind of once I sort of hit upon the idea of this girls' school, and kind of put that in conversation with that mental image, that's really sort of where the book came from.
Sort of all clicked into place.
Yeah.
And
slowly over 7 years.
well, yeah. Nothing comes quickly, unfortunately.
No, it just does not.
So, as you mentioned, it's set in, I think you said 1871. And so was that an era that you were already familiar with? What kind of research did you have to undertake? And was it a case of that you sort of did, I mean, you mentioned obviously your visit, which kind of kicked off things in your mind, but
Right.
Was it something that you wanted to research before you even started writing, or did you start writing and research as you go, or did you just write the whole draft and then go back? How did you go about that?
More the second of those. So I really love researching, but I love it so much that I am always a little bit afraid of losing momentum on that stage and never actually getting to the writing, because it's a lot easier to read other people's books than to actually start writing your own. So it was an era. I mean, I read a lot of books sort of set around that time and written in around that time as a child. I grew up in Connecticut in a house that was from the 1730s and a town that was from the 1600s. And I think as a result of that, the house was one of these big wide floorboards that kind of creaked when you walked around. And, I was always kind of looking for secret passageways, and the basement had a dirt floor and these kind of, 1700s tree trunks kind of holding everything up. So I think that many different eras have always seemed sort of present to me, and there was always this sort of sense that you were living in kind of many layers of time. So I think that it didn't feel, my imagination felt pretty comfortable in 1871. I think by being the kind of writer that, just makes up a strange species of bird.
You weren't too worried about it.
Yeah. I mean, I don't ever want to get things wrong, but I am also never going to be the kind of historical fiction writer who is going to be trying to give you sort of a very, a really dense kind of record of the moment. Like, when I'm turning to the past, I want to catch the flavor of it. I don't want to I don't want to be inaccurate, but I am also not trying to pretend that I am writing a book in 1871.
Sure.
I am often trying to use the past as a lens to look at something that interests me in the present, I think.
Well, on that subject, kind of links to that. I know, if you write a historical novel, there's lots of different ways you can do it in terms of style of language and everything else. Some people write them very contemporary. Some people try to adopt a style that they sort of think fits with literature that might have been coming out around the same time. There's lots of different ways. So kind of give us a sense of the kind of style that you landed on. And was it a case of, again, that you just kind of started writing and that's what came out? Or was that a very conscious thing about how you were going to approach that? And did you was it something that you ran past other people, or you tried out on people, or was it a case of this is how I'm going to write it and off I go?
Well, so the sound of things is very, very important to me as a writer, and I kind of don't have anything until I have that. So I and it's a case of wanting to catch sort of the feel and the flavor of the era, but not I'm never attempting to parrot the era exactly. Like, I mean, people wrote books in 1871, so we don't need me to sort of pretend as if I am a citizen of that era. I'm trying to is sort of the way that I feel about it, at least as a writer. So I'm trying to catch kind of the feel and the voice of the minds that I am sort of exploring. And so in this case, that's Caroline's mind. And so I think that the thing that I try to remember as I'm writing, and this just is, I think, a taste thing, but sort of, she's not going to be any more interested in sort of the fabric, the specific fabric of the drapes, or the particular contents of her dinner plate than a contemporary character would be. And so I try not to give details that are there only because I have researched them and want to show.
Which historical novels definitely can fall into that trap.
Some can fall into that, so I think that for me, the sound is important, but sort of the faithfulness of the sound matters less to me in some ways than its faithfulness to the story
and the character, presumably.
And to sort of the tone and the feel of the story that I'm wanting to tell. So I tend not to show people drafts before I feel like I have the sound at least partially right, just because I don't feel very solid about anything. And this goes whether I'm writing historically or not, until I have a sound that I am excited about in the sentences. It really just doesn't feel to me to be worth anybody else's time. If I can't make that work, it's not a story that I'm going to stick with.
So without giving away any spoilers or anything like that, if there was one thing that you'd like readers to take away from reading this book, what do you think it would be?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, so I think that what I'm looking to do, I think I am always going to be the kind of writer who is looking to raise questions rather than sort of answering them for the reader. But I think that what I'm wanting readers to think about is the way in which we perhaps still tell young women different things about their lives and their possibilities than we actually end up offering them. And I think that is something that I don't think I really knew consciously that I was writing about at the time. But I do think that turns out to be very true in certain ways. I mean, I think I was raised sort of, if you had asked me when I was 17, about feminism, I think I would have told you that was something that, that was great that we did that. And isn't that great that that's all sorted out now? And then I think as you grow up and you kind of move into the world and, you perhaps have children and you experience how the world sees you as a woman. I think that I think there was a way in which it was very surprising to me to sort of hold up the things that I had been told as a child and then hold up the things that the world actually sort of presents to you as a woman and sort of, and compare those things. And I think that the book is about a kind of more extreme version of those tensions in some ways. And so I think that I am wanting readers to think about the ways in which we still perhaps are making promises that we don't actually deliver on in the end. Absolutely.
Well, that's, as you say, it's great. It's the difference between things we're told and the reality that's actually presented for many people. Yeah. Well, that's great. Well, let's step away a little bit from the book. Let's go back a little bit. So why don't you tell me a little bit about, you've kind of hinted at it when you were talking about the book in terms of where you grew up, but tell us a little bit about your background, where you grew up, and what your earliest memory of writing was. Do you remember when you first sort of stumbled into writing?
Yeah. So I think that I basically became a writer because I was such a sort of obsessive reader as a child that I think that books, I was the kind of reader that I brought books to like many socially inappropriate places to bring books to, just because I was much more comfortable, I think, with books than with other people, and especially with other children for a long time. And so I think that I really felt, my life felt, books felt as real to me as anything else in my life for a lot of my childhood, I think. And so I think that kind of love, like when it sort of eats you alive like that, eventually you're going to want to try to do it yourself. And then there's this long period in which there's this sort of depressing contrast between, the books that you love and what you are actually able to produce. And I feel like maybe we all just sort of live there forever in some ways. But so I think probably as like a, 8, 9, 10-year-old got very excited about writing stories and, would begin, various novels, none of which I ever finished. But I loved the idea of inventing a whole world like that. And I noticed, pretty quickly, I think, when trying to write, that it was a feeling kind of like reading, but more, that you really got to be in this place, and that you had sort of absolute freedom in that space. And then I think as I moved into high school, I was a very serious student, and I think that a lot of it was, again, just sort of not necessarily feeling all that comfortable in the rest of my life. And so this was one thing I could control, was like working really, really hard at school. And so I think I kind of moved away from creative writing just because I was doing so much analytical writing. And but then in college, I began taking writing workshops, and I went to get my MFA, my Master of Fine Arts in writing, right out of undergrad. And I think, and I had many professors that told me that it was a better idea to wait and sort of, maybe move out into the world a little bit before, just continuing to write in an academic setting. And I didn't listen to them. And I do wish in retrospect in some ways that I had. I think for me, I think I went to grad school before I really understood what I was about as a writer. I knew that I wanted to write, but I don't think I really understood what kind of writing would really be mine. And what I was writing at the time were these very, very sort of careful, quiet, very realistic, sort of family drama type stories, in which I think I was so afraid of doing anything incorrectly that I really wasn't doing anything. So, there'd be these like long, tense dinner scenes where everyone is very unhappy, but no one's going to say why. And then they just sort of tensely pass food to each other, and then the scene ends, and I think that really it wasn't until kind of my mid to late 20s that I started figuring out, oh, I really like making sort of surreal things happen on the page, which was definitely a thing I had known in early childhood and then had kind of forgotten, I think. And so I had a novel that was my thesis for graduate school that was in that kind of careful, quiet, dead, realistic vein, which I love many novels that could be described that way, I should clarify, but mine just wasn't very good.
Yeah, I know what you're saying, yeah.
Yeah, it was so sort of governed by fear, I think, that it just, and so I wrote that book for a lot of years, and kept kind of, I was teaching high school English at the time, so I would kind of get it out every summer and kind of try to rework it. And meanwhile, I was also writing these short stories that were getting stranger and stranger and sort of more and more exciting to me. And I ended up getting an agent who is still my agent with that novel, the Dead novel, but we didn't end up selling it, which now I am very glad about. At the time, not so much.
Sure. Yeah.
But and by the time all of this kind of shook out and it became clear that the novel wouldn't sell, we had just moved from Massachusetts to Pittsburgh for my husband's job, like a couple of months before we heard the last no on that novel. And I had our first daughter. So I had a baby and I was in a new city where I knew no one. And this novel that I had been writing for 8 years didn't sell. And so it was kind of a grim
Sure,
couple
yeah.
of weeks. But I ended up winning this grant that I had applied for as like a 9 months pregnant person and then forgotten about because I thought it was sort of out of my league. And I had applied for it with one of my short stories, one of my sort of stranger tilting stories. And I ended up getting a phone call 2 weeks after I learned that the novel wouldn't sell, that I had won that grant. And so that was a very sort of needed boost. And it felt like sort of this message from the universe that like, okay, so this project didn't work and it needs to go live in a drawer. But maybe look at what's working in these other stories. And so I ended up putting those stories together into a book that came out in 2016. So before this novel, with a small press here, a wonderful small press called Lookout Books. Which they have a literary magazine that's sort of a sister imprint to their book publishing. And so I had met them through publishing a story with that literary journal a few years earlier. So that was sort of the journey of my becoming a writer. And then sort of in and amongst kind of all these other pieces, I had begun work on The Illness Lesson.
And that kind of gone from there. So obviously in that, as you say, that grim, as you described it, a grim time, you know, where you where you thought, well, okay, that's that. Do you think if it hadn't have been, obviously you'd applied for it, which is the key thing, but do you think if you hadn't have got that, that email through or whatever, that letter that came through to say that you'd won the grant or whatever, do you think did you feel like you would have returned to writing? I mean, I'm guessing you would eventually, but at the time, how did you feel about it? Did you think, well, I've given it a shot and now I'm not that's it sort of thing?
Well, so I think I wrote a whole essay about this actually, because the grant was, I mean, just a tiny little blurb, but the grant was the National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, which is just sort of this unrestricted money with which you're meant to just pursue a creative project. And we are always talking in this country about cutting funding for those grants. And so the last time that became like a really pressing discussion, I wrote this whole kind of impassioned thing about I do think it would have been harder and slower for me, not just because of the money, but because of the sort of affirmation of that. And there really aren't that many grants that work that way, that sort of are rewarding you for promise more than for a piece of work you've already managed to produce. And it takes money and time and belief to produce these projects. And so I think that the things that reinforce that belief are worth so much in the life of a writer. But so I think that I would have returned to writing just because I do think it's the way that I process the world. I don't think I work very well when I'm not writing. But I did, those couple of weeks really were, I think I felt very kind of unmoored because, I had always sort of assumed that that this novel that now lives in a drawer was sort of my big important work. And when that didn't work, and I was sort of in this house with this baby, I just felt like I had somehow managed to become this sort of entirely unplanned person, this housewife in a strange city. Yeah. And it was a really sort of unsettling time. And my dad is still so proud of himself because, of course I was calling my parents all the time and like weeping on the phone about just sort of it was so hopeless. And my dad, he still remembers, he often reminds me, he said, it will all work out, just not in the way you expect.
which pretty much sums up life. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Exactly. But he felt very sort of, very proud of himself when the grant phone call came. He's like, see?
It's total vindication. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
So do you think writing those, that collection, is that the collection that became We Show What We Have Learned? Yeah. So do you think writing those short stories, and as you say, more in the style that's closer to what your debut novel became, that kind of more of a surreal edge to it, do you think that sort of gave you permission to write in that way? When you were writing, because presumably not presumably, I know from doing it myself, the thing with the short story, or when you sit down to write a short story, there's not that pressure that you've got when you sit down to write a novel. And sometimes, short stories become novels for that reason, because you haven't got the pressure, and so you just kind of don't put the brakes on yourself, and it just goes where it goes. But did you find that when you were writing short stories? What did you get out of that experience of writing short stories?
Well, I think that's exactly it. And I think it was a permission that I had given myself in order to write the stories, but that I only learned through writing those how important that permission is. I think that, the stories, I think, became what they became because they were sort of my creative break from my real work, and so they were places for me to sort of risk and experiment and just try things out just because I wanted to. And I think that they, as a result of that, had this sort of life in them and this kind of joy in them, which is a strange word to use because many of the stories are very, very dark. but I think you could tell that at some point I had enjoyed creating them. And I think that was the feeling that was sort of missing from the original novel. And I think that as writers, we don't always really know where the real work is. And that was what I had sort of realized once I started looking at the stories and realizing, oh, these really are a book. And they really are actually saying something that I didn't know beforehand that I thought. Many of the stories are also about teaching. Many of them are sort of about these strange transformations that people undergo and kind of inflict on themselves and others. And I sort of, I had managed through not thinking that they were the real work to do a lot of real work in them. And so I think that is something that I try to carry forward with me now, and that I certainly tried to carry forward with me into the illness lesson as well, is just this idea that if you aren't risking something when you're writing, you really probably aren't doing very much. And so I think it's important early on in the process, at least, to remember that it really is pretty risk-free. No one has to see what you're doing. And so if it doesn't work, then it doesn't work, and I think that freedom, holding on to that for as much of the process as I can manage, turns out to be important to me in terms of allowing myself the space in which to really manage to end up doing something, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. So, and do you find that are you still writing short stories now in between projects and different things?
I am. I love the story form. I think I always will. There's something I think the ending of a short story is just one of them. I mean, they're so hard, but they are one of, I think, the most sort of satisfying artistic moments that we have. And I do think I will always feel sort of drawn to them as a result of that.
And it sounds like it, as you say, it works and gives you fuel for your longer projects as well anyway.
Right.
It's a little bit like, I always think of it as with musicians or singers, when you first start learning an instrument or singing, at the beginning, you tend to copy people, or you want to sing like it in a certain way. There might be somebody that you like or an artist that you like, and sort of through doing that, that's how you find your voice, and that's how you work out what your thing is, isn't it?
Yes, I think that's right. Yeah. And through also, I mean, I always am telling students as well, just like to just read everything you can, and try to read. I mean, I think we're always telling students to read like a writer, and I think that's good advice. But I also think that reading like a reader, like that sort of purest, most joyous thing that made many of us want to do this in the first place, just not losing touch with that, because I think publishing is this very sort of long road, and there are all these places in it that are not a ton of fun. And I think if you can kind of keep connected to that kind of appreciation for books that really made us all get into this in the first place, I think that turns out to be pretty important.
Because I think what's actually really hard, I agree with you, you do tend to, after you've been doing it for a while, you do tend to read things as a writer.
Yeah.
But I think a really, really good skill is to be able to read your own work like a reader. And that's really difficult.
It is. And I think that's really what I mean, when I revise, that's mostly what I'm doing, I mean, I don't know if that's entirely true. I'm reading like a writer too, but I print the thing off and I just read it with a pen, and I just don't let myself keep going. If there's something that I feel like as a reader, I'd be like, that's kind of clunky, or that's, like it's sort of, reading like you're like, I mean, you want to read your own work with love to a certain extent, because otherwise, if you lose faith in it too early, the whole thing is just sort of hopeless. But I do think reading it very rigorously, and through the lens of someone who is not predisposed to love these people that you've invented, and trying to convince that person to feel absorbed enough in this world to keep going, I think that is important.
Yeah, because I think it's what's tricky about it is, I think you're right. I think you do need to read it with an editorial mind, and you need to be thinking about the language and the description and everything else. But you also, I think the really tricky thing is, I think you can learn all that stuff to a certain extent. I think the thing that's really hard is being able to step back and just try to experience it as if it was the first time that you were reading it, and it was the first time that you're coming across it, and you haven't got, a built-in connection to the characters in the world. And I think that is, it's almost impossible, but
it is.
You kind of have to do it. Yeah, it's why you need an editor.
Editors, we really do need them, because to some extent it's sort of like trying to bite your own teeth, you
That's
can't
a great
get
way
past
of putting it.
the sort of inside knowledge that you do have. And I'm always amazed, when I finally get notes from editors at just the total blind spots that I have managed to have. And just, really, I get so focused on sort of the trees that I do miss the forest a lot of the time in kind of early drafts, in terms of, I have really thought about every comma, but, someone will be like, why is this mother so mean? And you're like, huh,
yeah.
I don't know. I should write a bunch more scenes.
I didn't actually realize that she was, Yeah, I totally understand. And it's when you know things, or things that are coming, that obviously the person reading it might not know about, or or even you can, when you've edited something, you can even find that you've taken something out that actually you needed, because now it's an important piece of information that you're now not giving, but you just assume that it's there because you know about it already. Which is quite easy to do. So if you were sitting down to write a novel tomorrow, let's say an idea pops into your head this evening, or you've already had one last week or whatever, or you go to your book of ideas or whatever it is, tell me how that works for you. What does that look like if you're starting a new project?
Well, I try. So I think I have a pretty healthy type A portion of my personality, which can definitely get in my way as a writer. I think a lot of what I was doing when I was talking about that sort of early work that never took on life, I think I was kind of trying to control it too much. That being said, though, I think I do feel most comfortable when I can structure the work itself, not the content, but when I can structure sort of how I will attack the project. So I am writing a new novel right now, and I have sort of made this ridiculous schedule of sort of how many pages I need to write per day, in order to finish by a certain time. And then within that structure, I can feel sort of relaxed enough to stop paying attention long enough to do interesting things, hopefully. And I do tend to, in early drafts, I try really hard not to use that editing part of my brain that we were talking about, just because I get totally paralyzed if I do that. And I try, eventually I will obsess about these sentences, and I will obsess about these characters, and I will think very, very carefully about what needs to be there that is not there yet. But early on, I try to just sort of go, and as a result, I am always finding things in early drafts that I really have very little memory of writing. And I feel like early drafts, it's almost more like dreaming than anything else. Like you're just kind of trying to follow the current of a feeling, and kind of hit the benchmarks of the things that you kind of know need to happen along the way. And then you can go back and take out the stuff that isn't working, which is, copious.
But the fact that you say you know the things that should happen. So do you plan before you sit down? Have you got and if so, do you write that down, or is it just more of a general thing in your head?
So it goes both ways. I try not to plan too extensively, because I think that is when I get into trouble in terms of just not allowing the space for things to surprise me. But I think it is helpful, like if I'm beginning a new chapter, to kind of know, like, basically, I'm going to be in these 2 points of view at these particular times. And this is like essentially what I want to have happen by the end of the chapter. So if I write anything down, it's a few words, it's not an outline. I used to really, really do a huge outline before writing. And I think that for me, that tipped over into holding it too tightly, and not allowing, it gave my editorial brain too much control.
Did you tend to find that you spent a long time on the the overview of it.
Yes, I did. And then I also, having done that, I would then spend forever sort of obsessively, like, I'd write a sentence and reread it 4 times before moving on to the next one.
Uh-huh.
And the thing is that even when you do that, you still have to rip it all up and sort of start over at various points and take out whole pages and so I think I have learned that, nothing about writing is efficient, but I have learned that the way that it works for me is very, very recursive. It is returning to this thing endlessly. And so therefore it doesn't matter that much if this sentence yet is perfect. It's sort of, it matters much more whether the sentence has caught something interesting and exciting that on the 8th revisitation, I will be able to make into something
refine,
perfect,
Yeah. What would you say is your favorite part of the process?
That part, actually, the sort of endless revisiting. I do not love first draft writing, I think, because I don't fully understand it. I don't really know where that dreamy part comes from. And somehow I feel much more relaxed once I have something on the page and once I can sort of tell myself that I'm just fixing it, even though I am actually doing, I would say, like 95% of the writing during that time. It's just I'm doing it all over, scrawling it all over the page in these tiny little, notes and things and Xing out paragraphs and jotting them down on the back. But somehow fixing something that I have just feels much less daunting to me than sitting down to an actual blank page.
Yeah. What would you say drives you to write in the first place?
That's an interesting question. I have wondered that. I mean, there are times where you're like, what am I doing? Sitting in this room and just spending all this time with these people who are not real.
I could just be watching Netflix box sets.
Right. So I think that for me, the original drive comes out of the feeling that I have when I read something that I love. I mean, I think sort of as I was saying, I think it's that feeling of just loving that sense so much of sinking into this world that someone else has made and really sinking into the heads of people who are not me. I think that is such an extraordinary thing that fiction can do and that really we don't get to do anywhere else. This really inhabiting someone else's view of the world. And so I think that I find that just magical. And so I think that I am writing in order to try to do that. I think ultimately, I also do think that it is an important part of my processing of the world in ways that I am usually not fully aware of until I have written, and then there's that feeling of reading over what you've written and thinking like, so I guess that's what I think about that.
Yeah.
So I think that's where it comes from. I mean, I don't think that it's sort of a conscious thing. I think that's probably what has propelled me to do this.
And that's why you enjoy it so much. So you mentioned I can't remember whether it was on air or before we started chatting properly, but you've got a couple of children, young children as well. So how do you actually fit writing around, in inverted commas, real life? Because I know that's tricky.
It's easier when there's not a pandemic.
Everything's easier when there's not a pandemic.
Right. So I think that for me, really, my entire career has happened as a parent of small children. So I think that for me, it has been a lot about, when I would write before I had kids, I had all of these very sort of precious ideas about what I needed in order to write well. I mostly wrote in the summers because I was teaching. And I guess that's the other thing that I would say is that kids for me have just been a sort of different version of the problem that I feel like I've always had with writing. I don't really know any writers who feel like they have enough time to write. There are always other tasks that the world has given us, and they're always sort of more straightforward than the writing. And so we always end up doing them, sort of first or more urgently. So I mostly wrote in the summers because that was sort of my free time when I was teaching before I had children. And I would sort of feel like I needed to read something really inspiring for, maybe 45 minutes before I would start writing. And then, I would write for a little while and then maybe I would take a walk to sort of feel extra inspired and read again. And now I am much more efficient. Like if I have 2 hours and I have an amount of sort of pages or words that I want to get done in that time, I will get that done because I know what will happen after those 2 hours are up and whoever it is wakes up or comes home or, or whatever. I mean, I do think that for me, daycare has been very, very important.
Mm-hmm.
Both my daughters at 6 months went to daycare for at least part-time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think just sort of structuring periods of time where they are not, awake and needing me.
Mm-hmm.
And during the pandemic, that really meant making very ruthless use of my then 3-year-old, now 4-year-old. She turned 4 in December. So her nap time was sort of sacrosanct. I would not do anything else. I would try to get, that day's writing done
Mm-hmm.
during that time.
Mm-hmm.
And the 7-year-old would go to her room. We would just tell her,
Yeah.
this is your quiet time. She would go up and maybe read a little and play some Minecraft and do
Yeah.
So I think it's really, I can't afford to be as precious as I once was about how much time I need. I think.
Do you think in a way, and I'm saying children just because you mentioned children, but it can be whatever, can't it? It's real life, as you say, is what all the other things that get in the way anyway. But do you think the fact that now your time is more at a premium, do you think in a way it's kind of made you not better, as in a better writer, but do you think it has made you more efficient for that reason?
I think it has. I think it has really made me embrace very fully this kind of recursive process that I was telling you about, because I also think that it would be very paralyzing if I was telling myself that in those 2 hours, I really had to write well that day,
Yeah,
and I think the thing that I love about endlessly revisiting is that it actually doesn't matter if any one of those sort of passes through goes particularly well, because you're going to fix it tomorrow.
Yeah.
So it's about moving yourself that one more step down the path toward where you want to be, as opposed to, I think for a long time I had this view that something sort of magical had to align in order for the writing session to be sort of productive, that it had to really be, I had to have done a really good job and have written something, really great already in that time in order for it to have felt like useful time.
Yeah.
And I think that for me, figuring out a process where I don't have to put that pressure on any one increment of hours, has been important, and something that I think probably having children has made me embrace, because it's just, you never know like how much sleep you will have gotten the night before, how sort of uncluttered your mind will feel at any particular stretch of time. And so it's just, if you can tell yourself, well, I'm going to build on this.
Yeah.
This is just sort of one sort of step.
Yeah.
That has been helpful to me and sort of probably efficient in the end.
Yeah. That's great advice anyway, I think, to anybody, because I think we all do get a bit precious sometimes when we're doing it. And sometimes it's harder as well, especially if you're normally busy and you've normally got things going on, whether it's kids or it's a job or whatever. And then in those rare times where you suddenly find that you have got like a bunch of time, like a whole afternoon or something like that, or a whole morning or something. Sometimes, I don't know whether you're the same, but sometimes it's almost like I've got so much time, I don't know which thing I should be focusing on or what I should be doing in that time, because I feel really precious. It's got to be really good. It's got to be really, I've got to get, I don't get this very often, so I've got to make sure that it's something great.
And, it's not great. What's wrong with me? I had time. Why couldn't I write something great? So I think for me, like divorcing what I actually produce from any kind of like verdict I'm trying to pass on myself and how good I am, has been very important. Because I just have learned that like the thing that's so wonderful about a book or a story or even just a paragraph is that it can end up being sort of smarter than you are, because it's not you, it's 85 different versions of you.
Yeah.
And so it just doesn't matter what the 81st of them looked like or the 17th, and so I don't know, it's something I try to, with mixed success, but I'm often trying to kind of remind myself of that.
Yeah. It's almost like you have to trick yourself into it.
Right.
So as we kind of move towards wrapping things up, so what would you say has been the most helpful piece of creative or inspirational advice that you've been given along the way? And that might not necessarily be specifically writing advice. It could be anything, something that you think's really kind of helped you or kind of really landed with you at a particular moment in your life.
So I think for me, the most important thing that I have had to learn, and many people have given me this advice along the way, but I think patience has been a very important thing for me to strive for as a writer. And that's in sort of every stage of the process. So I think that and so probably this has felt so monumental to me because I think I am not by nature a very patient person. And I think that if you had told me as a 22-year-old person that it would take me until I was 34 to publish my first book, that story collection in 2016, I think I just wouldn't have believed it. I think I would have, I mean, I think in my head, I was totally going to have a novel published by the time I was 25 or something. And I think I just had no idea what it would actually take to produce good work. And it takes so much more time than I ever could have understood. And so I think patience with the work itself has been the most important thing probably for me to learn. It's just that good work has its own timeline. And it does not, you can plan it out and you can plan out how you're attacking it. And that does help me. But you cannot actually plan. You can't really plan when you're going to be done, because done might be 5 years from now when you've learned the last thing you needed to learn to make the thing actually work. But I also think patience with the world's response to your work too. I mean, I think we really have so little control over publishing in many ways. I think you can do the best you can to kind of align things for yourself, but it's not going to happen according to a timeline that you have set out ahead of time. And so I think that has been important.
No, well, that's great advice. And it's been really fun to talk to you. So just as we kind of close things out, can you give us a sense of what might be up next, and also obviously remind people where they can find the book and where they can find out more about you as well?
Yeah. So the illness lesson should be available pretty much everywhere books are sold. I would vote for independent booksellers, whenever possible. I just think they are such a totally crucial part of our literary ecosystem, and one that has really suffered in this pandemic. So I'm always looking for opportunities to sort of just remind people that it's worth the extra bit of money and the extra bit of time to order directly from independent booksellers when you can. I am writing a new novel. I am sort of a third to half of the way through a draft of it. It is set in the 1940s. And it has to do with a sort of manor hospital where a husband and wife doctor team are trying out a new cure for miscarriage that they believe that they have sort of discovered, and this small group of patients and this husband and wife doctor team, and then strange things ensue. Wow,
sounds good.
Thanks.
Sounds good. Yeah. And where can people find you on social media and stuff, Claire?
So I am on Twitter and on Instagram. I'm not as quite as active there, but I think I'm Claire. I always forget my actual Twitter handle. I think I'm Clare.Beams on Twitter.
I can find it and put it in the show notes as well.
Oh, fabulous! And yes, and my website too, clarebeams.com. And then yes, through Doubleday and Doubleday UK.
Brilliant. Well, I'll put all those in the show notes, but it's been great to speak to you, Claire. Good luck with the book. And
thank you so much.
Hopefully speak to you again in the future. Great to talk to you.
This was wonderful, Wayne. Thank you.
There you go. Thanks again to Clare Beams, whose book, The Illness Lesson, is available right now. And I'll put all of her links in the show notes over at joinedupwriting.co.uk. That's it for this week, other than me reminding you to make sure you subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Overcast, or wherever else you get your podcasts from. And that way you can have the podcast downloaded automatically every time. Also, remember to leave us a nice rating and review on Apple Podcasts, because it really does help others to find the show, and it keeps keep things ticking over. Or just recommend it to one of your friends. But anyway, that's it for this week. Thanks for listening. I'm Wayne Kelly. Happy writing. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time.